Guys, the semester is over. You heard me right. I made it through another one. It's done. It's capiche. It's kaput. It's done. And this has been a really, really tough one. There's been a lot going on. I'm moving into some of the really more complicated stuff, and I'm tired. So for those of you who don't know, I am currently just finished my third semester for my PhD. I have undergraduate. I double majored in English and writing. I have 2 master's degrees, and I am now starting a PhD. And weirdly enough, this channel has been here for like basically that entire time, considering that Michaela and I started the original version of this channel when we were doing book clubs in the summer after our freshman year. So this channel has been here through this entire process, and I swear to God, this better be the last one, because I am tired. This has been a lot, and I'm ready to not be in school anymore and to do things with these degrees that I have taken all of this time getting. So my master's degrees are in, one is a Master of Science in Library Science, and the other is a Master of Arts in Children's Literature. And I turned a total about face, and or not really an about face, but just something that I didn't expect, which is I'm getting a PhD in a specialization of the education field. So I should have a PhD in education in a bajillion years. I was going part-time my first year because I was working full-time, and this year I got an assistantship on campus, so I'm now working part-time and going to school full-time. And that meant that for the first time ever at this degree program, I took 3 classes this year, and they were on very different topics. And I thought, since I don't have anything else to talk about, that I will show you guys some of the books that I read for my classes this year. Now, these readings do not include the bajillion articles, papers, stuff like that we read for those classes. I'm literally just going to show you the books that I have, and some of them were digital, and I will talk about those and just kind of give you a sense on what that reading looked like for me this year. So I want to start with one that might not be the most interesting to people. It was actually a class that I was really nervous about. So I am getting a qualitative research PhD. And basically that means that when I do research, I use qualitative data. This is essentially not numbers-based data. And quantitative studies or quantitative work is the really, really math and statistics heavy type of research. There are people who do mixed methods research where they marry the two. Some focus on one or the other. And because I'm doing a qualitative-based research PhD, I'm required to take 2 quantitative research methods classes, and I took one of them, my first one, this semester, and it was so amazing. The professor did an amazing job scaffolding the class, and so in the end I really wasn't that nervous about it, and it ended up being really awesome, and I enjoyed it. And it was basically a survey class over different methods of quantitative research, and the final project was to make your own research study with what you learned. Not that you actually ran it, but you mocked it up. And so with that, we read, this is very thrilling, I know, the APA publication manual. Academia takes this so seriously, guys, and this might be like redundant for some people, but as someone who, like I said, my other degrees are in predominantly English fields, and so when I was doing my papers for those classes, I was often using the MLA citation style. And now in my current field, I will be using APA for the most part. So it's actually really good that I have this, and I am glad that we read it. There's a lot of tricksy things that will really help me when I go to hopefully publish my stuff in journals. So it might not be that exciting, but at this point, it's good for me to have one of these. So the main manual that we used to go over our survey of design methods was Educational Research, Planning, Conducting, and Evaluating Quantitative and Qualitative Research by John Cresswell. Now, this is a book that does focus on both quantitative and qualitative methods. So I guess it's been published enough times and some people were actually familiar with it because they've used it in other classes. So you could use this to learn about quantitative and qualitative work. Obviously, we focused on the chapters in here that were on quantitative work. And what I really liked about this book was that not only did it kind of explain stuff to you, but there was also a pretend researcher and research study that this pretend researcher was doing. And as it introduced you to new concept, it kind of showed how basically someone would use the concepts, even though it wasn't a real research study. So I appreciated it. It was very easy to read. I really enjoyed it. And like I said, that class was shockingly enjoyable despite what I thought was going to happen in it. I took another class that focused on language development and acquisition. Now, when we're talking language development, we're technically talking about how children acquire language, but there was a particular focus in this class too on bilingual learners, also known as English as a second language, English language learners. There was a lot of people in the class who are getting their master's in bilingual education. I was one of the few people in this class not doing that. So that was really interesting. I got to learn from all of them. So my focus definitely was on just in general, how children go from not having language to being able to speak and what that process is like. But again, a lot of the books that I have actually focus on bilingual education. So the book that I took the most out of and yet also had some really interesting issues with was this book. This is the second edition of Literacies by Mary Calancis, Bill Cope, Evelyn Chan, and Leanne Daly Trim. These folks were some of the people who first started talking about multimodalities and how to learn multimodally. So not just focusing on, reading and writing, but how can we integrate new technologies into the classroom? And the thing is that even though this book is at this point with this new edition not that old, it's already a little bit out of date. So that was one of the issues once it started trying to give you chapters where it incorporated technology into the classroom. I also just didn't like some of their language and the ways that they talked about things, and I thought that when they started talking about culture stuff, they could have pressed a little bit harder. But overall, very clear, very easy to read, and a very good synopsis of how children develop language and also how language development has been seen in the classroom. Because the United States classroom, I'm sure this is true around the world, but specifically speaking in the US context, we've gone through a variety of different ways that we considered the best practice for learning, and that has definitely changed quite a bit. And this book also goes over that and why certain methods are good, why certain methods are bad, and why we are where we are or were at the moment this book was published in how we teach literacy to children and how we can then expand upon that as well. One of the books that we read that focused on bilingual or translanguaging in the classroom is this giant book here, The Translanguaging Classroom, Leveraging Student Bilingualism for Learning by Ofelia Garcia, Susanna Ibarra-Johnson, and Kate Seltzer. And I have to admit that this was probably the one that I got the least out of, not because it was a bad book, but because it wasn't relevant to me. I am not currently in a K through 12 classroom with bilingual students, and I imagine that this is far more interesting to people where that is the case. But it does talk a lot about the concept of translanguaging, which is basically when you have a classroom full of people who either speak multiple languages and maybe English isn't their first language, and letting them use their home language to make sense of English work and not putting down a hammer and saying, no, you must only speak English in this classroom, and letting children use what they already know to make sense of a language they don't understand as well. It has a lot of different examples, ways that you can use translanguaging in the classroom. It might be of interest to you if you are trying to teach in a bilingual space. I am not, but I did the reading mostly. So the last book that I have, I don't have a physical copy of, but it was called The Reading Turnaround. And while this book focused on first younger learners, I found a little bit more relevance in this one though, because I felt like some of the learning, like every chapter focused on an element of a young child's language and literacy acquisition. And so while many of the strategies were focused on ELL learners, I thought that plenty of it could be applied to kids who are not catching on to literacy as fast as other kids, and things like being like culturally relevant and bringing the child's life into the classroom and being like, okay, so you don't want to read this book. Is it because it has no relevance to you? And if I find you something that has relevance to you, maybe you'll be more interested in reading. And so I appreciated that there was fast, easy to read chapters with like a paragraph, like strategy 1, strategy 2, strategy 3, broken up by different elements of literacy learning. And I use that one a little bit more, like in my papers and stuff. It worked out for me more. And again, so easy to read. So if you have younger, particularly ELL students, it might be of use to you. So finally, I'm in a class on ethnography. If you're like, ethnography is an anthropology thing, right? Or you're like, what in the world is ethnography? Essentially, ethnography is a way of doing research where a researcher or a team of researchers typically goes out into the field and just kind of hangs out with people and learns about real people through observation and conversation, participation, sometimes with more formal methods like interviews, but also sometimes a more informal interview, like, just hanging out. Maybe you're in a classroom and you're just chatting with students. Obviously, all of this is done under the auspices of, you're allowed to do this research. You're not just showing up randomly and asking people to talk to you. You are in a research space, but it's about understanding the culture of individual spaces. This class is year long, and so you will hear about it again. I have a whole other semester of this in the spring because we're doing year-long ethnographic projects. And so I did a lot of reading for this, and what I'm about to share with you is only like the top of what we have read or been exposed to in this class. But just to kind of start you off with, we did some summer reading where basically we all read a ethnography to kind of like start seeing what they look like in novel form. And I read Haunting and the Educational Imagination by Barbara Regenspan. I have my issues with this book, but I think I also really resonated with it because when she's talking about hauntings or hauntology, what she means is what is missing in curriculum, who is missing in curriculum, and what we're not talking about. Because when we make a curriculum or we teach a class, like, we automatically choose stuff to leave out as much as we choose what to leave in. And we normally think more about what we've included rather than what isn't there. And some students, if you exclude potentially their history or people who look like them or whatever, she uses the word haunted or hauntings, this ghost in the curriculum, this elephant in the room. So I related to a lot of those when we're talking about specifically the history curriculum, which is what I focus on. So again, have my issues with the book. It was not like very accessibly written, but for that concept, I did enjoy it. We also read quite a bit of Ethnographic Methods by Karen O'Reilly, and I really appreciated what we've read from this book because it's just very clear. Some things like interviewing, for example, they do work a similar way to a more concrete research project, but when you're doing ethnography, it's more conversational. And so the idea of walking into a space and, a person sits down and you ask them questions and then they leave, like, that's not really an ethnographic interview, which are more conversational, free form, and often happen multiple times as you gain trust with someone. So she took things like interviewing and applied them and showed you how to apply them in an ethnographic context in a very clear and readable manner. There was also writing ethnographic field notes by 3 authors, Emerson, Fretz, and Shaw. This has multiple editions, and I honestly can't tell you which edition we're reading out of because it's all digital, so I don't know. But this is one of the main texts out there about how you write field notes, which essentially is, you know, you're out in your space and things are happening. And so you can't take detailed notes, right? So you take the notes you can, and then you go home and you write up something called field notes. And this is like expansive, minute by minute, second by second, descriptive. You're basically writing a novel. Like, things I learned in my writing degree on how to set a scene work really well here, because you're trying to capture all 5 senses, everything that's happening in this moment, so that when you go to write your full paper report, like, you really can remember what it was like to exist in that space. And this is a great book on doing that. The one that me and my research partner have been focusing on a lot is Digital Ethnography, Principles and Practice. And I'm just gonna say by Pink et al. Because there's a lot of authors on this book. And we're focusing on this one because our project also involves digital spaces. And so, like, a traditional ethnography is, say, in a classroom, and you're in the classroom and what's in the classroom is in your space. We're focusing on online spaces and technology, which are a little bit more like disparate, right? And they're all over the place and can be a little bit harder to enter as well, depending on the space. So this book, this Pink text, is several different ways theorists of how to do digital ethnography, but then every chapter within the context of what they're talking about, they give you examples of projects that the authors themselves have done. Most of them are like 2 to 3 years long, and so they're not really applicable to this year-long project that we're trying to pull off, but it's one of the few major texts that we're using in this class that use digital spaces and aren't like traditional ethnography texts. So in that sense, it's been the most useful. Again, this only just scrapes the surface of what I have been reading this year, but hope it gives you some kind of flavor on what I've been working on. Some of it more related to what I hope to do for my dissertation and my comps than others, but it's done. It's done, and that is all I care about. So I look forward to getting back to doing more fun reading with you guys, and I will see you then. Bye.